On the morning of July 28, 2003, firefighters in Orange, Texas responded to a report of a fire at Webb's Bait Farm, a rural property on the outskirts of town. When they arrived, they found a small shed on fire and what appeared to be a straightforward structure fire. But as firefighters moved in to fight the blaze, they had no idea they were approaching a deadly trap. Hidden inside the burning building were numerous propane tanks that had been stored improperly. At approximately 11 a.m., the shed exploded with devastating force, killing 2 firefighters instantly and injuring several others. This is the story of the disaster at Webb's Bait Farm, a preventable tragedy that highlighted the deadly dangers firefighters face when hazardous materials are stored illegally, and the importance of proper hazmat protocols. Webb's Bait Farm was a small rural business located on Highway 87 in Orange, Texas, near the Louisiana border in southeast Texas. The property was owned and operated by the Webb family and served primarily as a bait shop for local fishermen. The area is bayou country, swampy, rural, and dotted with small businesses catering to fishing and hunting. The property consisted of several buildings and structures. The main bait shop building, various storage sheds, outbuildings for equipment and supplies, open land. Like many rural properties in Texas, Webb's Bait Farm was somewhat informal in its operations. Structures had been added over time, storage was haphazard, and record-keeping was minimal. It was the kind of small family business common in rural America, functional but not particularly organized. What wasn't immediately obvious to anyone outside the Webb family was that one of the sheds on the property was being used to store a large quantity of propane tanks. These weren't just the small propane cylinders you'd use for a camping stove. There were numerous 20-pound tanks, the size typically used for gas grills, and possibly larger tanks as well. The exact reason for storing so many propane tanks is unclear. They may have been for sale, for personal use, collected over time, or stored for someone else. What is clear is that storing this quantity of propane in an unventilated wooden shed was extremely dangerous and almost certainly violated fire codes and safety regulations. Propane is a highly flammable gas. When stored in pressurized tanks and exposed to heat, like from a fire, the tanks can explode with devastating force. This is why fire codes strictly regulate the storage of propane and other compressed gases. They must be stored in well-ventilated areas, away from ignition sources with proper safety measures. The shed at Webb's Bait Farm had none of these protections. It was essentially a wooden box filled with bombs, waiting for a spark. On the morning of July 28, 2003, a fire started at Webb's Bait Farm. The exact cause of the initial fire has never been definitively determined, but it appears to have started in or near the shed that contained the propane tanks. Possible causes include electrical malfunction, spontaneous combustion of stored materials, smoking materials, an accident or carelessness. Whatever started the fire, by the time it was discovered, the shed was burning. Someone at the property called 911 to report the fire. The call went out to the Orange Fire Department around 10:30 to 10:45 a.m. It was described as a structure fire at a rural property, a routine call for a rural fire department. Multiple units from the Orange Fire Department responded, including engine companies, firefighters trained in structure fire suppression, command staff. Among the responding firefighters were Captain Michael Tello and firefighter Jimmy Goolsby, 2 experienced members of the Orange Fire Department who had responded to countless fires during their careers. The firefighters arrived at Webb's Bait Farm and found a shed fully involved in flames. From their perspective, it appeared to be a standard structure fire, a building burning, but not an immediate threat to other structures or people. The shed was somewhat isolated from other buildings on the property. The firefighters began their standard approach to fighting a structure fire, establishing water supply, positioning engines and hoses, preparing to enter or approach the burning structure to fight the fire from close range, assessing whether the fire might spread to other buildings. Here's the critical point. No one told the firefighters that the burning shed was full of propane tanks. Property owners either didn't realize the danger, didn't think to mention it, or assumed the firefighters would somehow know. The firefighters, following standard procedures for a structure fire, began moving closer to the building to fight the fire effectively. As the fire intensified, the heat inside the shed was rapidly rising. The propane tanks were being heated. As propane tanks heat up, the pressure inside increases. If the temperature gets high enough, the tanks can fail catastrophically. Either the relief valve fails, the tank ruptures, or in the worst case, the tank explodes. Multiple propane tanks in a burning building create a scenario that firefighters call a BLEVE, boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. When one tank explodes, it can trigger a chain reaction, causing other tanks to explode in rapid succession. The firefighters at Webb's bait farm were approaching a BLEVE waiting to happen, and they had no idea. At approximately 11 a.m., about 15 to 20 minutes after firefighters arrived, the shed exploded. The explosion was massive. Multiple propane tanks detonated simultaneously, creating a blast that could be heard for miles. The shed was obliterated, transformed from a burning building into flying shrapnel and debris in an instant. Captain Michael Tello and firefighter Jimmy Goolsby were in the blast zone. They were killed instantly by the explosion, either from the blast force, from flying debris, or from being struck by exploding tank fragments that became deadly projectiles. Several other firefighters were injured by the blast. Some were knocked off their feet by the shockwave. Others were hit by flying debris. The explosion scattered burning materials across the property, starting additional fires. The scene transformed from a routine structure fire into a mass casualty incident and disaster scene. Emergency responders from across the region responded to the explosion. Additional fire units, EMS, law enforcement, and eventually state and federal investigators converged on Webb's bait farm. The first priority was accounting for all firefighters and ensuring no one else was trapped or missing. The second priority was treating the injured. Several firefighters were transported to hospitals with various injuries, though thankfully none as severe as the two who died. The third priority was recovering the bodies of Captain Tello and firefighter Goolsby and securing the scene for investigation. The explosion and the deaths of two firefighters made news across Texas and nationally within the firefighting community. Firefighter fatalities always receive significant attention because firefighters are willing to risk their lives to save others, but they shouldn't die in preventable incidents caused by negligence or inadequate safety measures. Captain Michael Tello had been with the Orange Fire Department for many years. He was an experienced officer who had led firefighters through countless emergencies. He left behind a family and a department that mourned his loss. Firefighter Jimmy Goolsby was similarly experienced and respected. He was known as someone who could be counted on in any emergency, someone who showed up and did the work without complaint. Both men had survived decades of dangerous firefighting work, only to be killed by an explosion they had no warning about. The investigation into the disaster was extensive, involving the Orange Fire Department, the Texas State Fire Marshal's Office, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, other state and federal agencies. The findings were damning and focused on several critical failures. Improper storage of hazardous materials. The propane tanks were stored in violation of fire codes and safety regulations. The quantity of propane stored in an unventilated wooden structure created an extremely hazardous situation. Failure to inform emergency responders. When the fire was reported, and when firefighters arrived, no one informed them about the propane tanks. If firefighters had known about the hazmat situation, they would have approached the fire completely differently, establishing a safety perimeter, using defensive tactics from a distance, and possibly letting the fire burn in a controlled manner rather than approaching it. Lack of hazmat awareness. The property owners apparently didn't fully understand the danger they had created by storing propane in that manner. Or if they did understand, they failed to communicate it. Code enforcement failures. Questions were raised about whether local fire marshals or code enforcement had inspected the property and whether the improper propane storage should have been discovered before it caused a tragedy. The investigation also examined firefighter procedures and whether there were any failings in how the fire department approached the scene. However, the general consensus was that the firefighters did everything right based on the information they had. They followed standard procedures for a structure fire. The problem was they didn't know they were dealing with a hazmat situation. In firefighting, there's a principle. You can't fight what you don't know is there. Firefighters need accurate information about what's in a burning building to make safe tactical decisions. Without that information, they're operating blind. Following the deaths of Captain Tello and firefighter Goolsby, there were calls for criminal charges against the property owners for negligent homicide or similar charges. However, the legal outcome is unclear from historical records. It appears that while violations were documented, criminal prosecutions may have been difficult to pursue or may have resulted in lesser charges. Civil lawsuits were likely filed by the families of the fallen firefighters, though specific outcomes are not well documented in public records. What is clear is that the incident led to increased emphasis on several areas. Hazmat pre-planning. Fire departments increased efforts to identify properties in their coverage areas that might contain hazardous materials. Pre-incident planning became more rigorous, with firefighters visiting businesses and properties to understand what hazards might be present. Code enforcement. Fire marshals and code enforcement became more vigilant about illegal storage of propane and other hazardous materials. The disaster highlighted that lax enforcement could get firefighters killed. Communication. The importance of property owners immediately informing 911 dispatchers and responding firefighters about any hazardous materials became a major training focus. Defensive operations. Firefighters were reminded that sometimes the best tactic is to establish a perimeter and let a fire burn, especially when hazardous materials are involved. Not every fire needs to be aggressively attacked. Sometimes the safest approach is defensive operations from a distance. The deaths of Captain Michael Tello and firefighter Jimmy Goolsby were honored by the firefighting community. Their names were added to the National Fallen Firefighters Memorial. Memorial services were held. The Orange Fire Department and the broader Texas firefighting community mourned. For the families of the fallen firefighters, the loss was devastating. These men had gone to work expecting a routine day and never came home. Their deaths were preventable if only someone had told them about the propane. The Webb's bait farm. Disaster is remembered in firefighting circles as a cautionary tale about hidden hazards and the importance of hazmat awareness. It's taught in fire academies as an example of how quickly a routine call can turn deadly when hazardous materials are involved. The incident at Webb's bait farm teaches several critical lessons. For property owners, if you store hazardous materials, propane, chemicals, ammunition, etc., you must inform emergency responders immediately if there's a fire. That information could save their lives. For firefighters, always assume there could be hazards you don't know about. Ask questions. Don't assume a structure fire is routine. Be cautious about aggressive interior attacks when you're unsure of building contents. For regulators, code enforcement isn't just bureaucracy, it's life safety. Illegal storage of hazardous materials can kill people. For everyone, firefighters risk their lives to protect us. Least we can do is not create preventable dangers through negligence or ignorance. On July 28, 2003, Captain Michael Tello and firefighter Jimmy Goolsby responded to what they thought was a routine structure fire at Webb's bait farm in Orange, Texas. They were doing their jobs protecting property and ensuring the fire didn't spread. They didn't know they were approaching a building full of propane tanks. No one told them. At 11 a.m., the building exploded. Both firefighters were killed instantly. Their deaths were entirely preventable. If the propane had been stored properly, if firefighters had been informed about the hazard, if proper safety protocols had been followed. But they weren't. And 2 firefighters paid with their lives. Rest in peace, Captain Michael Tello and firefighter Jimmy Goolsby. You died doing a job that required you to trust that people would give you accurate information about the dangers you faced. That trust was betrayed, and you paid the ultimate price. The disaster at Webb's bait farm is a reminder that firefighters don't just die in dramatic building collapses or wildfires. Sometimes they die because someone stored propane improperly and didn't tell anyone. Sometimes they die because of negligence, ignorance, and failures of communication. Webb's bait farm no longer operates. The property has changed hands. The shed that exploded is long gone. But the memory remains of July 28, 2003, when 2 firefighters went to fight a fire and never came home. Their sacrifice taught lessons that continue to protect firefighters today. But those lessons came at too high a price. To fight a fire and never came home. Their sacrifice taught lessons that continue to protect firefighters today. But those lessons came at too high a price.